After my son died of a heart attack, my daughter-in-law called 911 and said I was the one responsible. I never thought a mother's love could become her own conviction. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd tell anyone. And if, for just a second, you feel like this sounds familiar, I only ask that you leave a like and subscribe. It will help me keep unburdening my soul. My name is Stella Miller. I'm 67 years old, and I live in a small clapboard house in the town of Maple Creek, Pennsylvania. My hands are marked by 40 years of working the counter at the local diner, and my back stoops a little more each morning when I get out of the bed I bought on layaway 15 years ago. The smell of coffee and bacon grease seems to have seeped into my skin, just like the sound of the parish church bells that have marked the hours of my day since I was a girl. I wear a blue knit shawl my mother made for me before she died, and I always carry a small, worn holy card of the Virgin Mary in my pocket, its edges softened from all the times I've clutched it when I'm nervous. The deep lines around my brown eyes don't just speak of age, but of the sleepless nights I spent watching over my son Brian when he was little, and later when he grew up and still needed me in ways I didn't fully understand. Brian was my only child, a 42-year-old man who worked as a supervisor at a textile mill just outside of town. He had his father's strong hands, but the gentle eyes he inherited from me. He lived in the house right next door with his wife, Alina, and my two grandchildren, Emmett, who's 14, and Sophia, who's 11. The houses were so close I could hear when they played their music too loud or when the kids were roughhousing in the backyard. It was an ordinary Tuesday in October. The leaves of the maple trees were beginning to litter the town's old brick sidewalks, and I had just finished hanging the laundry on the line when I heard something that made my blood run cold. They weren't normal shouts. They were the desperate sounds a mother recognizes instantly, as if something primal inside me had sounded an alarm. Brian, don't do this to me." Alina's voice cut through the thin walls like a knife. I dropped the last damp sheet and ran to their house, my heart hammering against my ribs. The front door was wide open, which never happened because Alina was always complaining that the neighbors in this town are too nosy. When I walked into their living room, I saw him. My Brian was lying on the cold linoleum floor, next to the recliner where he always sat to watch the sports highlights after work. All the color had drained from his face, and his mouth was half open, as if he'd tried to say something, but the words had gotten stuck in his throat. His eyes, those eyes that had looked at me with unconditional love for 42 years, were glassy and fixed on the ceiling. Alina was kneeling beside him, the phone pressed to her ear, screaming at the 911 operator. She was wearing a red silk blouse I'd never seen before, her hair perfectly styled, and she even had makeup on, as if she'd been expecting a special occasion. My legs trembling, I rushed over and knelt on Brian's other side. I placed my hand on his chest, desperately searching for a heartbeat, for any sign that my son was still with me. "Brian, my love, don't leave me," I whispered, stroking his forehead, which was already cool to the touch. "It's Mom. Stay with me." But what I heard next shattered my soul. Alina, still on the phone, said in a clear, steady voice, "Yes, officer," it was his mother. She came over to argue with him. She was screaming at him, telling him he was a bad son, that he didn't take care of her. "My husband has a heart condition, and she knew it. She caused this. I'm sure of it." The world stopped. I was paralyzed, my hand still on my son's motionless chest, as Alina's words ricocheted in my ears like stray bullets. What was she talking about? I had come running when I heard her screams. I hadn't even spoken to Brian that morning. "What are you saying, Alina?" I asked, my voice breaking. "That's a lie. I just got here when I heard you yelling." She looked at me for the first time since I'd entered, and in her eyes, I saw something that scared me more than my son's death. There was hatred. A cold, calculated hatred, as if she had been waiting for this moment for years. "Don't play dumb, Stella," she said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Everyone knows how you pressured him, always coming over here with your complaints, making him feel guilty for not visiting you enough. Brian was stressed out because of you, and now look what happened." She hung up the phone and slowly got to her feet, brushing dust from her skirt as if it were nothing. She walked over to me, still kneeling beside my son's body, and bent down until her face was inches from mine. "Your son is in his grave because of you," she whispered, her breath smelling of mint and malice. "Aren't you ashamed? You were always a burden to him, an emotional parasite who wouldn't let him live in peace. And now you're going to pay for what you did." I stayed there, frozen, as the sirens of the ambulance grew closer, winding through the quiet streets of our town. The sound mixed with the nervous barking of neighborhood dogs and the voices of curious onlookers who were already starting to peek through their windows. The paramedics rushed in with their equipment, but it was already too late. One of them, a young man in a dark blue uniform, approached Alina to ask what had happened. "My husband had a heart attack," she said, wiping away tears that had appeared as if by magic. "His mother came over to fight with him. She was always doing that. She put him under so much pressure, and he couldn't handle the stress." The paramedic looked at me with an expression I knew all too well. It was the same look teachers gave me when Emmett got into trouble at school, the same one doctors used when I told them I didn't have enough money to cover the copay. It was a mixture of pity and judgment, as if I were some troublesome old woman who didn't know how to behave. As they loaded my Brian's body onto the gurney, Alina walked over to the paramedic and handed him a piece of paper. "Here," she said. "This is his cardiologist's number. My husband's heart had been very bad lately, and the doctor told him to avoid stressful situations. His mother didn't understand, or didn't want to." I stood in the empty living room, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic the paramedics had left behind, as my world crumbled piece by piece. On the coffee table, Brian's mug was still half full, the newspaper folded to the sports section he always read first. On the wall hung a photograph of the whole family in the Poconos, taken last year for my birthday. Brian had his arm around my shoulders and was smiling with that genuine joy he only showed when we were together. Alina was on the other side, a forced smile on her face, with the kids in front, making funny faces. Now that picture felt like a lie. Alina came back from the hospital 3 hours later, dressed all in black, her eyes red from crying. But when she saw me standing in my yard, waiting to ask her about the funeral arrangements, her expression changed completely. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice as sharp as broken glass. "I'm his mother, Alina. I need to know about the funeral, about the kids." "The kids are being taken care of," she cut me off. "And the funeral. That's a family matter. For the people who truly loved Brian." She turned and walked toward her house, but before closing the door, she looked back at me one last time. "Stella," she said, "I hope you can live with yourself after what you did, because I will never forgive you." The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the silent neighborhood. That night, alone in my house that suddenly felt too big and too empty, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea in my trembling hands. My mother's shawl was draped over the back of a chair, and for the first time in years, I put it on my shoulders to feel some warmth. Outside, rain began to fall on the shingles of the neighborhood roofs, creating a melancholy rhythm that had always soothed me. But that night, every drop sounded like an accusation. Was it really me? The next 3 days were the longest of my life. While I remained shut in my house, waiting for news about my own son's funeral, Alina became the perfect neighborhood widow. I watched from my window as she received visitors with condolences. Mrs. Gable from across the street arrived with a chicken casserole. Mrs. Henderson brought flowers from the farmer's market. Even Father Michael from the parish came to bless the house and console the poor widow. They all walked through Alina's front door, but no one knocked on mine. I was the mother of the deceased, yet I was invisible, as if my pain didn't matter, as if my 42 years of raising Brian had never existed. I stayed glued to the lace curtain, watching my daughter-in-law play the role of her life while I became the villain of my own tragedy. On Wednesday morning, Emmett knocked on my door. My 14-year-old grandson stood on my threshold, his eyes swollen and wearing the Pittsburgh Steelers jersey I'd given him for his birthday. When I saw him, my heart broke all over again. "Grandma," he said, his voice choked, "is it true what Mom's saying? Did you make Dad angry and that's why he died?" I was speechless. How do you explain to a 14-year-old boy that his mother is lying? How do you tell him that the woman who tucks him in at night is capable of inventing something so horrific? "No, sweetheart," I said, pulling him into a hug. I loved your father so much. He was my whole world. But Emmett pulled away, confused. Mom says you were always bothering him, that you asked him for money and made him feel bad. She says that's why Dad had a bad heart. Every word from my grandson was another nail in my coffin. Alina hadn't just falsely accused me. She was poisoning my own grandchildren against me. When was the last time you saw your dad and me argue? I asked, taking his hands in mine. Emmett frowned, thinking, I can't remember any time, Grandma. Then don't believe everything you hear, I said softly. Sometimes when people are very sad, they say things that aren't true. But before I could say more, I heard Alina's voice shouting from her house. Emmett, get over here right now. My grandson gave me an apologetic look and ran back to his house. From my window, I saw them talking in the yard. Alina was gesturing wildly, pointing toward my house, and Emmett nodded with his head down. When she finished, my grandson didn't look my way again. That same afternoon, I received a phone call that chilled me to the bone. Mrs. Stella Miller? A formal voice asked. Yes, this is she. This is Mr. Rodriguez from the St. Joseph Funeral Home. I'm calling to inform you that you are not authorized to attend the funeral service for Brian Miller tomorrow afternoon. It felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. What do you mean, not authorized? I'm his mother. The deceased's wife has specifically requested that you not be in attendance. She stated there are family issues and your presence could cause a disturbance. But he's my son, I murmured, my voice lost in tears. I'm very sorry, ma'am. These are the widow's instructions. I hung up the phone and collapsed onto the armchair where Brian used to sit when he'd visit on Sundays. It still smelled faintly of his lavender aftershave and the cigarette he would smoke secretly on my porch, away from Alina's eyes. I wasn't going to be able to say goodbye to my son. The next day, from my window, I watched the funeral procession arrive. The black hearse parked in front of Alina's house, followed by cars delivering flowers, wreaths, and finally, the polished wooden casket where my Brian lay. The neighbors gathered on the street, all dressed in black, whispering among themselves and casting glances toward my house. I saw my grandchildren leave, holding Alina's hands. Sophia, my 11-year-old granddaughter, wore a black dress I'd never seen before, her hair pulled back in a perfect bun. Emmett walked with his head down, dressed in a suit that was too big for him. As the procession started the slow walk toward St. Joseph's Church, I put on my oldest black dress and my shawl, and I followed from a distance, keeping to the trees in the park so they wouldn't see me. At the church, I stood in the last pew, hidden behind a pillar, watching as all the neighbors surrounded Alina with hugs and condolences. Father Michael spoke about the importance of family, about how Brian had been a good man who deserved to rest in peace. But every time someone mentioned his name, Alina would cover her face with an embroidered handkerchief and sob even louder. It was a perfect performance. Throughout the service, she kept glancing back, searching for me in the crowd. When she finally spotted me, she smiled. A cold, triumphant smile that made me understand that this was all part of her plan. After the burial at St. Joseph's Cemetery, while everyone went back to Alina's house for the reception, I stayed behind at my son's grave. There was a mountain of fresh flowers, red roses, white carnations, yellow gladiolas, all with cards that read, "For Brian, rest in peace," and, "To the Miller family, our deepest sympathies." None of those flowers were from me. I sat on the concrete bench next to the grave and spoke to my son for the first time since he had died. Brian, my love, I don't know what's happening. I don't understand why Alina is saying these horrible things about me. You know I loved you more than my own life. I would never have hurt you. Never. The wind rustled the dry leaves in the cemetery trees, and for a moment, I thought I heard his voice say, "I know, Mom. I know." But when I opened my eyes, there was only silence and the gray headstones stretching to the horizon. I returned to my house after dark. The lights were on at Alina's, and I could hear voices and laughter coming from the backyard. They were having the traditional post-funeral gathering, where family and friends share stories about the deceased and comfort one another. I ate a piece of dry toast with reheated coffee, alone in my kitchen, listening to the sounds of my family celebrating my son's life without me. 2 days after the funeral, when I thought the worst was over, there was a knock at my door. It was a young man holding a manila envelope. Mrs. Stella Miller? Yes. You've been served. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. The paper had the seal of the county family court, and the first few lines took my breath away. You are hereby notified that Mrs. Alina Miller has filed a civil suit against you for moral damages and negligent contribution to the death of Brian Miller. I kept reading, but the words blurred through my tears. Alina was officially suing me. She claimed that I had caused Brian chronic emotional distress, that my constant demands for attention and emotional manipulation had worsened his cardiac health, and that my toxic and parasitic behavior had been a direct factor in his death. The lawsuit demanded I be removed from any inheritance, that I be forbidden from contacting my grandchildren, and that I pay damages for emotional suffering to the family. I sat in my living room, the legal papers in my hand, feeling the world close in on me like a trap. Not only had I lost my son, not only had I been banned from his funeral, but now I faced losing my grandchildren and everything I had left of my family. That night, I called my sister Connie in Cleveland. We hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since a stupid fight over our mother's inheritance. "Connie," I said when she answered, "Brian's dead." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "What happened, Stella?" I told her everything. About the heart attack, about Alina's accusations, about the lawsuit. When I finished, my sister sighed heavily. "Oh, Stella, you always were too wrapped up in that boy. Maybe Alina has a point about some things." I hung up without saying goodbye. Even my own sister had turned her back on me. That night, alone in my house that felt more and more like a prison, I sat in front of the small altar in my bedroom with photos of my parents, and now, of Brian. I lit a candle and prayed to the Virgin Mary, asking her for the strength to understand what I had done wrong. Had I really been a toxic mother? Had my Sunday visits? My home-cooked meals? My questions about his day? Had they really made my son sick? For the first time in my life, I began to doubt myself. The following weeks turned into a silent hell. Every morning I would wake up hoping it had all been a horrible nightmare. But reality would hit me when I saw the empty chair at the table where Brian used to sit for Sunday breakfast. The lawsuit was just the beginning. Alina had started a systematic campaign to destroy my reputation throughout Maple Creek. First, it was the casual conversations at the grocery store. I'd go to buy my usual milk and bread, and the women I'd known for 20 years would suddenly go quiet. Mrs. Robinson, who sold flowers on the corner of Main Street, would avoid my gaze when I walked past her stand. Mr. Henderson, the butcher who always saved me the best cuts, now served me with a coldness and overcharged me. One day, while waiting at the bus stop, I heard 2 neighbors talking behind me. Poor Alina, left a widow so young, and all because of that crazy mother-in-law. I know, they say Mrs. Miller made Brian's life impossible, always going over to their house to fight and ask for money. And then she plays the victim. How shameful, acting like a spoiled child at her age. I turned to confront them, but when they saw me, they fell silent and moved away. It was Barb and her sister Carol, women I'd sung carols with at the town's Christmas festival for years, women I'd shared recipes and town gossip with. Now they looked at me like I was a stranger, like I was dangerous. The following Sunday, when I went to Mass at St. Joseph's as I had for 40 years, Father Michael stopped me at the entrance. "Stella," he said in a low voice, taking my arm, "I think it would be best if, for a while, you attended another parish. There are tensions in the community that need time to heal." I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. This was the same priest who had baptized Brian, who had officiated his first communion, who had given my husband his last rites 10 years ago. "Father, do you also believe I killed my son?" "It's not about what I believe, my child. It's about keeping peace in the community. Mrs. Miller is very respected here, and her children need stability during this difficult time. My grandchildren." It always came back to my grandchildren. I left the church without looking back, walking through the familiar streets of the town where I was born and raised, feeling every door, every window, every known face close to me. But the worst was yet to come. On Wednesday of that week, while sweeping the sidewalk in front of my house as I did every morning, I saw a white county car pull up. 2 women in professional attire got out and knocked on Alina's door. I recognized what was happening immediately. It was a visit from Child Protective Services to evaluate my grandchildren's well-being. From my yard, I could hear fragments of their conversation on Alina's porch. The children have been deeply affected by their father's death, I heard Alina say in that sweet voice she used when she wanted to manipulate someone. And the situation with their grandmother has made things worse. Emmett has been having nightmares, and Sophia has become very withdrawn. What kind of situation with the grandmother? One of the social workers asked. She keeps insisting on seeing them, even though her presence causes them great pain. She constantly reminds them that she had something to do with their father's death. It's very traumatic for children who are already suffering. Lies. It was all lies. Have the children expressed fear of their grandmother? There was a pause, and then I heard Sophia's small voice. Yes, ma'am. My grandma scares me now. Mom says it's her fault my daddy isn't with us anymore. It felt like my heart had been ripped out of my chest. My granddaughter, my little Sophia, who used to come to my house to bake chocolate chip cookies and tell me I was her favorite grandma in the world, was now afraid of me. The social worker continued. And you, Emmett? How do you feel about your grandmother? I don't know. My older grandson answered, his voice barely audible. I used to love her a lot. But Mom says she did bad things to my dad. I don't understand why a grandma would do that. The social workers stayed for another hour, asking questions, taking notes, evaluating the situation. When they left, one of them came to knock on my door. Mrs. Miller, we need to speak with you about your grandchildren. Please come in, I said, inviting them into my small living room that smelled of pine sol and vanilla. We've received reports that you are causing emotional distress to the minors. The mother is requesting that your contact with them be restricted until they can properly process their father's death. But they're my grandchildren, I protested. I've cared for them since they were born. I've never harmed them. We understand this is a difficult situation for you as well, Mrs. Miller. But our primary duty is to protect the well-being of the children. For now, we recommend you avoid direct contact with them. After they left, I sat in my living room, surrounded by the deepest silence I had ever experienced. On the walls hung photographs of Emmett and Sophia, on their birthdays, on Mother's Day, on Christmases past. In every photo, they were smiling, hugging me, happy. Now those images felt like evidence of a crime I had never committed. The days began to merge into a routine of isolation that was slowly killing me. I would get up at dawn, make coffee for one, sit at my table for two, and stare at the empty hours that stretched before me like a desert. Without a job, without family, without a community, I became a ghost living in my own home. The bills started to pile up. The widow's pension I received from Social Security barely covered the basics, and without the occasional help Brian gave me, the money ran out before the end of the month. The electricity, the gas, the phone, all came with shut-off notices. One Tuesday afternoon, while organizing my few important papers for the appointment with the public defender the court had assigned me, I found something that broke my heart into a million pieces. It was a Mother's Day card Brian had written me, just 3 months before he died. It was hidden among my receipts, in the messy handwriting he had when he was in a hurry. Dear Mom, I ran out of time and couldn't get you something nice for your day, but I want you to know you're the best mom in the world. Thanks for always looking after me, for worrying about me, for making me feel important. Sometimes Alina says I visit you too much, but I tell her a mom like you deserves all the visits in the world. Love, Brian. I cried over that card until my tears smudged the blue ink. It was proof that everything Alina was saying was a lie. Brian didn't feel pressured by me. He himself acknowledged that Alina complained about our visits. But who would believe me? Alina had constructed her version of events so skillfully that even I had begun to doubt my own memories. That night, while heating up a grilled cheese on the stove for dinner, I heard voices in the yard next door. I peeked through the kitchen window and saw something that froze me in my tracks. Alina was in her garden with a man I didn't recognize. He was younger than her, wore an expensive shirt, and had flashy gold rings on his fingers. He was holding her by the waist while she laughed in a way I hadn't seen her laugh in years. So when do you think the old lady next door is finally going to clear out? The man asked loudly, as if he knew I could hear them. Soon, Alina replied, stroking his face. Very soon. As soon as I win the lawsuit, I'm selling her house too. Brian left everything to me, and I have the right to get rid of anything that causes me trouble. And the kids? The kids will understand. They're going to have a new dad who actually knows how to take care of them. They kissed right there, in the garden where Brian had played with his children, where he had planted the rose bushes that bloomed every spring. My son had been dead for barely a month, and Alina already had a replacement. Everything became clear in that moment, as if a light had been switched on in a dark room. Alina wasn't destroying me out of grief or revenge. She was destroying me because I was an obstacle to her new life. She needed me to disappear so she could start over with her new man, with no inconvenient witnesses to her past. That night, I stayed awake until dawn, sitting in my rocking chair, looking out the window at the house where my son had lived, where my grandchildren had grown up, where I had hoped to grow old surrounded by family. For the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't cry. Instead, I felt something new growing in my chest. It wasn't sadness or fear. It was courage. And for the first time in weeks, I began to think that maybe I wasn't as helpless as Alina believed. The following Monday, armed with Brian's card and a determination I hadn't felt in weeks, I went to the office of Mr. Moreno, the public defender the court had assigned me. His office was in a rundown building downtown, with hallways that smelled of damp and cracked tile floors. Mr. Moreno was a man in his 50s, with messy gray hair and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. His desk was buried under mountains of yellowing case files, and when I arrived, he was eating from a half-eaten takeout container of Chinese food while reviewing some papers. "Mrs. Miller," he said without looking up, "I've reviewed your case. I have to be honest with you. It doesn't look good." "Sir, my daughter-in-law is lying," I said, pulling Brian's card from my purse. "I have proof that my son didn't feel pressured by me." He took the card with greasy fingers and read it quickly. "This is useless," he said, handing it back. "It's just a Mother's Day card. Any son would write something nice for his mother on a day like that, even if they had problems. But he specifically says that Alina complained about our visits." "Ma'am, listen to me," he interrupted, wiping his hands on a paper napkin. "Your daughter-in-law has witnesses. She has neighbors who will testify that you visited the house too often, that he looked stressed when he left your place. She has medical reports showing your son did, in fact, have a heart condition, and she has the paramedics' testimony about what she told them on the day of the heart attack." He leaned back in his chair, which groaned under his weight. "Besides, Mrs. Miller, I have to ask, did you really never argue with your son? Did you never ask him for financial help? Did you never complain about how your daughter-in-law treated you?" I fell silent because I knew that if I answered honestly, I would be admitting to things that could be used against me. Yes, Brian and I had had difficult conversations. Yes, I had asked for help when my refrigerator broke last year. Yes, I had told him when Alina treated me coldly or skipped family gatherings without explanation. "Your silence tells me everything," the lawyer continued. "Look, ma'am, I'm going to give you some advice. Take a settlement. Ask your daughter-in-law to drop the lawsuit in exchange for you renouncing any claim to the inheritance and agreeing to have no contact with the children. Are you suggesting I give up? I'm suggesting you be realistic. You don't have the money for a long legal battle. You don't have witnesses in your favor. And frankly, your daughter-in-law has a more compelling case than you do." I left that office feeling more defeated than ever. Even my own lawyer believed I was guilty. I walked aimlessly through the downtown streets, past the cathedral where I had taken Brian to Mass as a child, past the old theater where we had gone to see a show for his middle school graduation. Every place reminded me of the happy moments we had shared, moments that now felt like evidence against me. Returning to my house that afternoon, I found an envelope slipped under my door. There was no return address, just my name written in block letters. Inside was a photograph. It was a picture of Alina and her new man kissing in the garden. But what caught my attention wasn't them, but the date printed in the bottom corner. 2 days before Brian's death. Someone had taken this photo before my son's heart attack. With trembling hands, I turned the photo over. On the back, in the same block letters, someone had written, "There's more. Central Market, flower stall, tomorrow at 3 p.m. I couldn't sleep that night. Who had taken this picture? Why were they sending it to me? Was it a trap by Alina to frame me for something else? But the photograph was real. The date was real. And if Alina was already in a relationship before Brian died, then her entire grieving widow act was a monumental lie. The next day, I arrived at the Central Market 5 minutes before 3. The market was buzzing with activity, vendors shouting prices, the smell of fresh herbs and spices mixing with the smoke from the barbecue stand, children running between the stalls while their mothers haggled. The flower stall was run by an older woman, maybe 70, with white hair pulled into a bun and hands stained with soil. "Are you Stella?" she asked as I approached. I nodded nervously. "I'm Esperanza," she introduced herself. "I sent you the photo." "Why?" "Because I've known that snake for years," she said in a low voice, pretending to show me some roses. Alina was a customer of mine. She'd come to buy flowers for her meetings. Always red roses, always expensive, always paying with crisp new bills. Meetings? With married men, mostly. It's her specialty. She seduces them, gets their money, and when they're no use to her anymore, she destroys them. Your husband wasn't the first. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. Did my son know? Your son was a good man who married the wrong woman, Esperanza said, wrapping some daisies in newspaper. But he was afraid to divorce her because of the kids. Alina threatened that if he left her, she'd take the children and he'd never see them again. Do you have more proof? I have years of proof. Receipts for the flowers she bought for her dates, photos I took because it seemed suspicious for a married woman to be buying so many flowers just to decorate her house, and testimony from other vendors who saw her with different men. She handed me a paper bag full of daisies. But when I opened it at home, I found much more than flowers. There were dozens of receipts for purchases Alina had made over the last 2 years. Expensive flowers, imported wines, lingerie from brands I'd never even seen in the town's department store. All paid for in cash, all in amounts that didn't match Brian's salary. There were also more photographs. Alina with different men in fancy restaurants in the city, at luxury hotels, always dressed in clothes that cost more than my monthly rent. But the most shocking thing was a receipt from a private doctor in a wealthy suburb, dated 1 week before Brian's death. The receipt was for an emergency cardiovascular consultation and was in Brian Morales' name, but signed by Alina as responsible spouse. Had Brian gone to the doctor without my knowledge? Or had Alina arranged this consultation for purposes that had nothing to do with my son's health? On Thursday morning, I decided to do something I had never done in my life. I hired a private investigator. I used my last savings, the cash I kept in a coffee can for emergencies, and hired an investigator recommended by Esperanza. His name was Rick Vega, a former cop who now worked independently from a small office in a less reputable part of town. "Mrs. Miller," he said after reviewing all the evidence I showed him, "this isn't just a lawsuit for moral damages. This is fraud, emotional bigamy, and possibly something much worse." "What do you mean?" "Your daughter-in-law has been carrying on extramarital affairs for years, handling money that doesn't correspond to the known family income, and has manipulated medical information. But what worries me most is this receipt from the cardiologist." He took the paper and examined it with a magnifying glass. "See this signature? It doesn't match your daughter-in-law's handwriting on other documents. Someone else signed this, posing as her." "What does that mean?" "It means either someone took your son to the doctor without her knowledge, or this receipt is a complete forgery. In either case, we have evidence of document falsification." For the first time in weeks, I felt something like hope. "Can this change the outcome of the lawsuit?" "Ma'am, this can change everything. But I need you to give me 48 hours to dig deeper. If what I suspect is true, your daughter-in-law isn't just going to lose the lawsuit against you. What's going to happen to her?" Rick looked at me with a smile I hadn't seen since this whole nightmare began. "She's going to prison." 48 hours later, Rick summoned me to his office with an urgency in his voice I hadn't heard before. When I arrived, his desk was covered with documents, photographs, and papers that looked like the result of a police investigation. "Mrs. Miller, have a seat," he said seriously. "What I've found is much worse than we imagined." He took a thick folder and opened it in front of me. "Your daughter-in-law, Alina Miller, is not who she says she is. Her real name is Alina Vance, and she has a criminal record in 3 states, Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana." He showed me police mugshots where I immediately recognized Alina's face. but with different hairstyles and fake names. Fraud, embezzlement, forgery, bigamy. She's been using false identities for years to marry men with property and savings. Her method is always the same. She marries, has children to create strong emotional ties, psychologically manipulates her victims until they're isolated from their families, and when she has complete control of their finances, she destroys them. Have other men gone through this? 4 that we've been able to document. 2 died under suspicious circumstances related to heart problems. 1 committed suicide after she accused him of domestic violence and took his children. The 4th managed to divorce her but lost his house, his savings, and hasn't seen his daughter in 5 years. I felt sick to my stomach. My Brian had been just the latest in a series of victims. The children? The children are her most powerful tool. She trains them to testify against their fathers, manipulates them emotionally, and when she no longer needs them for her plans, she abandons them. We have a statement from a teacher in Ohio who says Alina left an 8-year-old girl at an orphanage after securing her father's inheritance. Rick pulled another document from the folder. But this is the most important thing. I found the real doctor who treated your son. He showed me a medical report on letterhead from UPMC in Pittsburgh. Your son was taken to the hospital 3 times in the last 6 weeks of his life. Not for heart problems, Mrs. Miller. For poisoning. Poisoning. Gradual poisoning with digitalis. It's a heart medication that, in small, steady doses, can cause fatal arrhythmias. The attending physician, Dr. Ramirez, suspected someone was giving him these substances without his knowledge, but your son refused to report his wife. My hands were shaking so much I couldn't hold the papers. Are you telling me that Alina murdered my son? I can't prove it in a court of law just yet, but I have very strong circumstantial evidence. Your son confessed to Dr. Ramirez that he had been feeling strange after meals his wife prepared, that he had dizzy spells and palpitations that only occurred at home. Rick showed me the doctor's handwritten notes. It says right here, patient reports episodes of distress coinciding with consumption of food prepared by spouse. Recommended toxicology screen, but patient refuses due to fear of family conflict. Why didn't Brian tell me any of this? Because your daughter-in-law had convinced him that you were part of the problem. According to the doctor's testimony, your son believed that if he divorced her, you would pressure him to go back to her, that you would make the children suffer more. Everything started to make sense in the most horrible way possible. Alina knew Brian loved me, and she used that love as a weapon against him. She made him believe that protecting me from the truth was how he could prove he was a good son. Rick nodded gravely, and when he finally decided to seek medical help and get a divorce, she sped up the process. The day he died, according to the records we were able to obtain, he had 3 times the lethal dose of digitalis in his system. I cried right there, in that office that smelled of cold coffee and stale smoke. But this time it wasn't a cry of grief, it was pure rage. What can we do? First, we're getting you a new lawyer. I know an excellent criminal defense attorney who takes pro bono cases when there are crimes of this magnitude. Second, we're going to request an exhumation of your son's body for a full toxicology analysis. And my grandchildren? Your grandchildren will be placed under state protection until this investigation is resolved. But Mrs. Miller, I have to warn you, this process is going to be long and painful. Alina is going to fight with everything she has. She already took my son, I said, wiping my tears. She can't take anything more from me. 3 days later, a convoy of police cars from the state prosecutor's office arrived in Maple Creek. It was a Friday morning, and I was watering my geraniums when I saw the detectives get out of their official vehicles. The whole street filled with curious neighbors. The same women who had turned their backs on me for weeks were now peering through their windows to see what was happening at the poor widow's house. Alina came out to meet the police in her pink housecoat, her hair perfectly coiffed as always. But when she saw the search warrant and the arrest warrant, her calm facade crumbled like a house of cards. "This is a mistake," she screamed as they cuffed her. "That crazy old woman is framing me. She killed my husband with her constant pressure." But the officers weren't listening anymore. They had enough evidence for a formal investigation. During the search, they found a safe hidden behind a dresser in the master bedroom. Inside were fake IDs with different names, photos of her previous victims, and most importantly, vials of heart medication that were not prescribed to anyone in the family. They also found correspondence with her current boyfriend, a married man from the city who had been sending her money for months, unaware that she was already planning her next move. But what struck me most was seeing my grandchildren when the social workers brought them out of the house. Emmett and Sophia looked confused and scared, but when they saw me standing in my yard, Sophia ran to me. "Grandma!" she cried, hugging me with a force I hadn't felt since before Brian's death. "I don't understand what's happening. Mom says you did something bad, but the police say she's the bad one." "My love," I said, stroking her hair. "Sometimes grown-ups get confused and say things that aren't true. What matters is that you and your brother are safe." Emmett approached more slowly, with the distrust of a 14-year-old. "Grandma, you really didn't do anything bad to my dad?" "Never, my boy. Your dad was the most important thing in my life." "Then why did Mom say those things?" "I don't know, Emmett. But we're going to find out the truth." The social workers explained that the children would be temporarily placed in a foster home while the investigation was ongoing, but that I had been removed from the list of people forbidden to see them. "Does that mean I can visit them?" "It means you can request supervised visits while permanent custody is determined," explained Ms. Torres, the new social worker assigned to the case. "Considering the new evidence, it's likely you will be considered for family custody." That afternoon, after Alina was taken away in the patrol car and the children were moved to their temporary home, I stood alone in my yard, looking at the house that had been the stage for so many lies. The neighbors started to approach, one by one. First was Mrs. Gable, who brought a bowl of soup and a stammered apology. Then came Esperanza from the market, who came to tell me she had given a full statement to the investigators. "Stella," Mrs. Gable said with her head bowed, "forgive us. We didn't know. We never imagined that woman was capable of—" "Don't worry, Mrs. Gable. No one could have imagined something like this. But inside, I knew the scars from these weeks would take a long time to heal." Father Michael arrived at dusk, walking slowly down the street, his black cassock billowing in the October wind. "Stella, my child," he said when he reached my door, "I've come to ask for your forgiveness on behalf of the entire community. We failed as Christians by judging you without knowing the truth. Father, you were only trying to keep the peace." "No, my child. Keeping the peace doesn't mean allowing injustice to be done. Allowing that woman to destroy you was my failure, and I will have to live with that." That night, for the first time in weeks, I could eat dinner without my hands shaking. I made a grilled cheese sandwich with the cheese Mrs. Gable had brought, poured myself a glass of cold water, and sat at the table where Brian used to join me on Sundays. His absence still hurt, but now it was a clean pain. It was no longer contaminated by guilt and doubt. My son had been murdered, but I was not the one to blame, and for the first time since it all began, I was certain that justice was coming. 2 months after Alina's arrest, the day of the final trial arrived. Patricia Mendez, the criminal lawyer who had taken my case, explained that this wasn't just a hearing about the original lawsuit against me, but a criminal trial for first-degree murder, fraud, and forgery. "Stella," she said as we walked toward the county courthouse downtown, "today isn't just about proving your innocence. Today, Alina is going to pay for every crime she has committed." The courthouse was imposing, with marble columns and hallways that echoed with the hurried steps of lawyers and clerks. I sat in the front row, wearing my best black dress and my mother's blue shawl, feeling the weight of all the eyes on me. The courtroom was packed. The families of Alina's other victims had come from Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana. Many neighbors from Maple Creek were also there, including Mrs. Gable, Esperanza, and even Father Michael. When they brought Alina in, dressed in the orange jumpsuit of the county jail, there was nothing left of the elegant, manipulative woman who had destroyed my life. Her hair was unkempt. She had deep, dark circles under her eyes, and she had lost a noticeable amount of weight. But what struck me most was her expression. There was no more malice or calculation, only desperation. The judge, an older man with a gray beard and a stern face, called the court to order. "We are here to hear the case of the Commonwealth versus Alina Vance, also known as Alina Miller, accused of the murder of Brian Miller and other related crimes." The first witness was Dr. Ramirez from the hospital. "Your Honor, he stated in a firm voice. Mr. Brian Miller came to my office on 3 occasions during the last weeks of his life. On each visit, he presented symptoms consistent with digitalis poisoning: arrhythmia, nausea, mental confusion, and extreme weakness. He showed the EKG charts and lab results. I strongly recommended he undergo toxicology tests, but he refused. He confessed to me that he was afraid if he accused his wife, she would take his children and destroy his mother, whom he described as the only person who truly loves me. Hearing those words broke my heart, but also filled me with a bitter satisfaction. My Brian knew who truly loved him. Did the patient directly express suspicion about his wife? Ms. Mendez asked. Yes. In his last consultation, 3 days before he died, he told me, quote, "Doctor, I think my wife is poisoning me, but I can't prove it. If something happens to me, please look after my mother. She is innocent of all of this." Murmurs filled the courtroom. Alina, who had been motionless until then, began to shake her head violently. "That's a lie!" she screamed from her seat. Brian was paranoid. He had mental problems because of his mother. The judge called for order, but her outburst only confirmed what we all already knew. She had lost control of the situation. The next witness was Rick Vega, the private investigator. Your Honor, during our investigation, we uncovered a criminal pattern stretching back over 15 years. The defendant has used at least 6 false identities to marry men of moderate financial means. He presented a map of the United States with red pins in different cities. In each case, the method was identical: seduction, quick marriage, immediate pregnancy to create emotional leverage, isolation of the victim from his family, complete control of finances, and finally, the physical or psychological elimination of the victim once she had obtained everything she needed. Can you specify the previous cases? In Cleveland, Ohio, Roberto Fernandez died of a supposed heart attack after she emptied his bank accounts. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, Arturo Castillo committed suicide after being falsely accused of domestic violence. In Ann Arbor, Michigan, Fernando Lopez is still alive but lost his home, his business, and hasn't seen his daughter in 5 years. Rick showed photographs of each of the victims. They were all hardworking men between 35 and 45 years old, with modest assets and close relationships with their mothers. The defendant specifically targeted victims with strong family ties because she knew those ties could be used as tools for manipulation. When it was my turn to testify, I took the stand, my legs trembling but with the certainty that I could finally speak the truth. Mrs. Miller, Ms. Mendez asked me, "What was your relationship with your son, Brian, really like?" "My son was my life," I answered, my voice clear. "After his father died 10 years ago, we were all each other had. We'd visit on Sundays, he'd help me with things around the house, and I'd cook him his favorite meals. Did you ever pressure your son to leave his wife?" "Never. I knew Alina didn't like me, but I also knew that Brian loved her and wanted his marriage to work. My job as a mother was to support him, not destroy his family." "Did your son ever tell you about problems in his marriage?" "Yes, but very rarely. Brian was a private man. Only when he was really distressed would he tell me that Alina yelled at him, that she made him feel small, or that she used the children to manipulate him. But he always ended by saying it was his fault, that he wasn't good enough for her." Ms. Mendez showed me the Mother's Day card Brian had written. "Do you recognize this document?" "It's a card my son wrote me 3 months before he died. In it, he says that Alina complained about our visits, but that he wasn't going to stop seeing me because a mom like me deserved all the visits in the world." When the card was read aloud, several people in the courtroom began to weep silently. The most dramatic moment came when they called my older grandson, Emmett, to testify. The judge had ordered that his testimony be taken in private, but allowed it to be broadcast via video into the main courtroom. Seeing my 14-year-old grandson sitting in that small chair, talking about his father's death, broke my heart all over again. "Emmett," the child psychologist guiding the interview asked gently, "do you remember ever seeing your grandmother argue with your dad?" "No, ma'am. My grandma never yelled at my dad. Actually, when she came over, my dad seemed happier." "And how did your mom act when your grandma visited?" "She'd get in a bad mood. She always found reasons for us to go to another room, or she'd say she had a headache. Then, after my grandma left, My mom would get on my dad's case about why he invited her. Did your dad invite your grandmother over, or did she just show up? My dad invited her. I sometimes heard him on the phone with her saying, "Mom, come have dinner with us on Sunday. It's been a while since we've had a good talk." Emmett's testimony was devastating to Alina's defense. My grandson, without fully understanding the implications of his words, was confirming that everything Alina had said about me was a lie. But the final blow came when they presented the results from the exhumation of Brian's body. The medical examiner, a man in his 60s in a white lab coat, took the stand with a folder full of technical reports. "Your Honor, the post-mortem toxicology reports confirm the presence of lethal levels of digoxin in the muscle and bone tissue of the deceased. These levels are consistent with gradual poisoning over a period of approximately 3 months. Can you explain how this substance entered the victim's system?" Digoxin is a medication not prescribed for young, healthy patients like Mr. Miller. Its presence in the body can only be explained by intentional, external administration. In what form is this medication commonly administered? In pills that can be crushed and mixed into food or drinks without significantly altering the taste, especially in heavily seasoned or sweet dishes. The medical examiner showed microscopic photographs of the analyzed tissues. Based on the concentration and distribution of the substance, we estimate that the victim was systematically poisoned over the last 90 days of his life, with a significant increase in dosage during the final week. When he finished his statement, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Alina had gone from hysterical denial to a dead calm, staring blankly at her cuffed hands as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her defense attorney, a young man who looked as defeated as his client, made one last desperate attempt. "Your Honor, my client has been the victim of a conspiracy to frame her. She is a woman who lost her husband and is now being persecuted by a resentful mother-in-law who cannot accept her own responsibility in her son's death. But no one believed him anymore. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies were consistent, and the truth had come out irrefutably." The judge announced a recess for deliberation. During the 2 hours we waited for the verdict, I sat in the courthouse hallway, surrounded by the people who had come to support me. Father Michael took my hand. "Stella, your son can rest in peace now." "Yes, Father. He can finally rest in peace." When the judge returned to the courtroom after 2 hours that felt like an eternity, the entire room fell silent. I had my hands clasped so tightly my fingers had gone numb, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. After careful review of all the evidence presented, the judge began in a solemn voice. "This court has reached the following conclusions." Alina was motionless in her chair, her gaze lost somewhere on the ceiling, as if she had decided to mentally transport herself to another place. "In the matter of the civil suit filed by Alina Vance against Stella Miller for alleged moral damages and emotional negligence, this court finds said suit to be entirely without merit. Mrs. Miller is hereby fully exonerated of all charges." I felt as if a 1,000-pound weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Several people in the room began to applaud softly, but the judge raised a hand for order. "Furthermore," he continued, "the evidence shows that the plaintiff acted with malice and premeditation to destroy Mrs. Miller's reputation through false statements and witness tampering. As for the criminal charges against Alina Vance, this court finds her guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Brian Miller, guilty of aggravated fraud for the use of false identities, guilty of forgery of official documents, and guilty of child endangerment and manipulation." The judge's voice grew sterner. "The evidence presented demonstrates a systematic criminal pattern spanning more than a decade, causing the death of at least 2 individuals and the irreparable psychological suffering of multiple families." Alina finally reacted. She shot up in her seat and began to scream. "No! This can't be happening. I loved Brian. I did everything for love." The bailiffs moved toward her, but the judge allowed her to continue. "That old woman poisoned him against me. I had to protect my marriage. I had to protect my children." "Ms. Vance," the judge said firmly, "your own words confirm the premeditation of your actions. This court sentences Alina Vance to a term of 40 years in prison without the possibility of parole for the crime of first-degree murder, plus an additional 10 years for the related felonies. 40 years. Alina was 38. She would be an old woman when she got out of prison, if she ever got out alive. In addition, the judge continued, the court orders the full restitution of all fraudulently obtained assets to the victims' families, and she is permanently barred from any contact with the minors involved in this case. The guards began to lead Alina away, but before she left the courtroom, she turned to me with a look of pure hatred. "This isn't over, Stella," she shrieked as they dragged her toward the door. "My children will know the truth. They'll know this was all your fault." But her voice faded down the hallway, and I knew those were the last words I would ever hear from the woman who had destroyed my family. After the verdict, Ms. Mendez explained the next steps. "Stella, now comes the custody process." As the children's only direct relative, you have priority to take custody of Emmett and Sophia. But they'll do a psychological and social evaluation to make sure you can provide the care they need. How long will that take? About 6 weeks. In the meantime, they'll remain in the temporary foster home, but you can visit them every day now if you want. 6 more weeks without my grandchildren, but at least now there was real hope of getting them back. I left the courthouse surrounded by reporters who wanted to interview me about the case that had captured the nation's attention. "The grandmother wrongfully accused" was the headline in all the papers, but I didn't want to be famous. I just wanted my life back and to take care of my grandchildren. Father Michael drove me back to Maple Creek in his old white sedan that smelled of incense and gasoline. On the way, he spoke to me about forgiveness and healing. "Stella, I know this has been a painful road, but now you have a chance to start over. Not just as a grandmother, but as a woman." "What do you mean, Father?" "Throughout these months, you've shown a strength you didn't even know you had. You fought for justice, you defended your son's memory, you protected your grandchildren. The woman returning home today is not the same one who felt guilty and defeated a few months ago." He was right. Something fundamental had changed in me. I was no longer just the grieving mother who had lost her son, or the desperate grandmother separated from her grandchildren. I was a woman who had faced injustice, and won. When we arrived in my neighborhood, the whole street was decorated with streamers and balloons. The neighbors had organized a small welcome home party for me. Mrs. Gable had made her famous pot roast, Esperanza had brought flowers from the market, and even Mr. Henderson the butcher had closed his shop early to be there. "Welcome home, Stella," they all shouted as I got out of the car. For the first time in months, I felt truly home. That night, alone in my house that no longer felt empty but full of possibilities, I sat before the altar where I kept the photos of my parents and Brian. I lit a new candle and spoke to them in a way I hadn't since this nightmare began. "Brian, my love, justice has been done. Your killer will pay for what she did to you, and your children will know the truth about who you really were. They were victims just like you, manipulated by someone who should have protected them." I took the photograph of Brian and me hugging in the Poconos and held it to my chest. "I promise you I will take care of Emmett and Sophia. I will give them all the love you couldn't in these last months. I will make sure they grow up knowing their dad was a good man who loved them more than his own life." The next morning, I began my new routine. I had a peaceful breakfast at my table, reading the newspaper without the constant anxiety that had plagued me for months. Then I drove to the foster home where my grandchildren were staying. Seeing Emmett and Sophia was like getting back a piece of my soul I thought was lost forever. Sophia ran to me and hugged me with the desperate strength of a child who has been afraid of losing someone important. "Grandma, is it true we don't have to be scared anymore?" "It's true, my love. You don't have to be scared of anything anymore." Emmett, always more reserved, approached slowly. "Grandma, did Mom really kill Dad?" It was an impossible question to answer simply, but I had learned that my grandchildren deserved the truth. "Your mom was very sick, Emmett. She did terrible things because she had problems she didn't know how to solve. That doesn't mean she didn't love you, but it does mean she couldn't take care of you the way you deserve. Are we sick like her too?" "No, my loves. You are healthy. Good children who deserve to grow up in peace and with a lot of love." Over the next few weeks, I started preparing to bring my grandchildren home. I cleaned and painted the room that had been Brian's as a child, bought new beds with my last savings, and turned my small sewing room into a study area. I also started therapy, something the social worker had recommended for all of us. At first, I resisted. because I had always believed problems were solved with family and faith, not with doctors. But I discovered that talking to someone neutral about everything I had been through helped me process the grief and rage in ways I hadn't imagined. Stella, my therapist, Dr. Herrera, said during one of our sessions, "You spent months feeling guilty for something you didn't do. Now that you know the truth, how do you feel about yourself?" "Free," I answered without hesitation. "For the first time in years, I feel free." Free from what? Free from guilt? Free from fear? Free from the need to justify my love for my son? Free from having to prove to anyone that I'm a good mother and a good grandmother? The doctor smiled. "That freedom is yours forever, Stella. No one can ever take it from you again." 6 weeks after the trial, I got the call I had been waiting for. "Mrs. Miller, this is Ms. Torres from CPS. I have good news. The psychological and social evaluation has been approved. The children can come home with you starting Monday." I hung up the phone and cried, but this time they were tears of pure joy. My grandchildren were coming home. My new life was about to begin. 6 months after Emmett and Sophia came to live with me, I woke up one Sunday morning without the weight on my chest that I had carried for so long. Sunlight streamed through the new, pale yellow curtains I'd bought, because I no longer wanted to live in the shadows. From the kitchen, I could hear my grandchildren arguing about what to have for breakfast. Emmett, now 15 and several inches taller, wanted eggs and sausage. Sophia, 12 and with a personality that grew stronger every day, insisted we should have pancakes because it was Sunday. "Grandma?" Sophia shouted from the dining room. "Tell Emmett that Sundays are for pancakes." "Pancakes are for little kids," Emmett shot back with typical teenage bravado. "I am a kid, you moron." I laughed as I made coffee in my new coffee maker, a gift I'd bought myself with the settlement I received from the state for the wrongful accusation I had endured. It wasn't a huge amount, but it had been enough to fix up the house, buy new furniture, and have a small financial cushion for emergencies. "You know what?" I said, poking my head into the dining room where they sat at the table that had belonged to my parents. "We're going to have eggs and sausage and pancakes. It's Sunday. We have time." "You're the best grandma in the world," Sophia yelled, running to hug me. Emmett, who had learned to show affection without embarrassment after months of family therapy, stood up and kissed my cheek. "Thanks for taking care of us, Grandma." Those simple words filled me with a happiness I hadn't felt in years. As we cooked together in the kitchen that now always smelled of home-cooked meals and laughter, I thought about everything that had changed since that terrible morning when Brian died. The house no longer felt like a museum of pain. There were new photographs on the walls: Emmett at his school soccer tournament, Sophia at her first communion, which we had celebrated 2 months ago, the three of us together at the 4th of July parade downtown. But I also kept the photos of Brian, because my grandchildren needed to remember their father as the good man he had been, not as the victim of a tragedy. The healing process hadn't been easy. Emmett had nightmares for the first few weeks, waking up screaming because he dreamed that I would disappear too. Sophia had developed an obsessive need to know where I was at all times, calling me every 10 minutes when I went out to run errands. But family therapy had helped tremendously. Dr. Herrera taught us to talk about our fears, about the confusion they felt having loved a mother who turned out to be a murderer, about how to process grief without feeling guilty. "It's not your fault you loved your mom," the doctor had explained in one of our sessions. "Children are wired to love their parents, even when those parents do terrible things. Your love doesn't make you bad people." Gradually, my grandchildren had begun to understand that they could keep the good memories of Alina while rejecting her criminal actions. "Grandma," Sophia had asked me one afternoon while we were doing homework, "do you think Mom ever really loved us?" "I think she loved you in the only way she knew how, my love. But sometimes people are so sick that their way of loving hurts others." "And Dad?" "Your dad loved you completely. Everything he did in his life, he did thinking of you." Now, 6 months later, I saw how my grandchildren were blossoming. Emmett had made new friends at school. His grades had improved, and he'd even started showing interest in a girl in his class who had him sighing like a teenage poet. Sophia had developed a passion for cooking and helped me prepare meals every day, inventing strange recipes that sometimes turned out delicious and other times ended up in the trash amidst laughter. But more important than any academic or social progress, They had regained the ability to laugh without guilt, to plan for the future without fear, to trust that the adults around them would not betray them. After breakfast, as was our new Sunday tradition, we walked to the Central Market to buy fresh ingredients for dinner. It was something I had started doing not just out of necessity, but because I enjoyed the routine, planning menus, having people to cook for with love. At the market, Mrs. Rodriguez, who sold produce, always saved us the best tomatoes. "How are my favorite grandkids?" she asked as she weighed the peppers we had chosen. "Doing great, Mrs. Rodriguez," Sophia answered with her newfound confidence. "My grandma's teaching us how to make her famous pot roast for the church potluck next month. You're so lucky to have such a wise grandma." Comments like that had become common. After everything that had happened, the people in town looked at me with a new respect. I was no longer just Stella who works at the diner. I was now Stella who fought for justice and won. But what I valued most was the respect of my own grandchildren. "Grandma," Emmett had told me last week, "my friends say you're really brave." Why do they say that? Because when everyone thought you did something wrong, you didn't give up. You kept fighting until you proved the truth. Those words had filled me with a pride I didn't know I could feel. We returned home loaded with bags from the market, and while Sophia and I prepped dinner, Emmett took care of his chores. I had established clear routines for all of us, not as punishments, but as ways for us to function as a family. Shared responsibility creates strong bonds, Dr. Herrera had explained, and she was right. At 3 o'clock, my sister Connie arrived from Cleveland. She had been visiting every month since the trial, trying to repair the relationship she had damaged when she hadn't believed me in my darkest hour. "Sister," she said as we drank coffee on the patio where I had planted new rose bushes, "I still can't believe everything you went through, and I can't believe the strength you had to come out on the other side." "You find strength when there's no other choice," I replied. "When you have people depending on you, you discover you can do things you never imagined. The kids look so good. They're healing. We're all healing." Connie took my hand. "Stella, I need to apologize again. When you called to tell me what was happening, I should have believed you instantly. I should have come to support you. We've already talked about this, Connie. The important thing is that you're here now. It's just that I'm so ashamed. My own sister asking for help and People do the best they can with the information they have at the time," I interrupted. Alina was very convincing. Even I started to doubt myself. "And now? You don't doubt anymore?" I thought about her question as I watched my grandchildren playing soccer in the yard with Mrs. Gable's kids. "Now I know who I am," I said finally. "I'm a woman who loved her son completely, who fought for the truth when all seemed lost, and who is raising 2 extraordinary children. I'm a woman who survived the worst and came out stronger. Aren't you afraid something like this will happen again?" "I'm afraid of a lot of things," I admitted. "I'm afraid my grandkids will get sick, that I won't have enough money for their college education, that something will happen to me and they'll be left alone. But I'm no longer afraid of being judged unfairly, because I learned that the truth always comes out, even if it takes time." That night, after Connie had gone back to her hotel and the children were asleep, I sat in my rocking chair with a cup of chamomile tea, looking out the window toward the house where Brian had lived. A young family with 2 small children lived there now. The husband worked in an office. The wife was an elementary school teacher, and their kids played in the same yard where Emmett and Sophia had played when they were little. Life went on, as it always does. There were days when I still missed Brian with an intensity that took my breath away, moments when I'd see Emmett make a gesture that reminded me of his father, or when Sophia would laugh in the same way Brian did as a boy. But it was no longer a destructive pain. It was a pain that connected me to love, that reminded me we had something beautiful worth missing. From the bookshelf next to my chair, I took the notebook where I had started writing our family stories for my grandchildren. I wanted them to have a complete record when they grew up of who their father was, what our family was like before the tragedy, and the lessons we had learned during our healing. Brian was a curious child, I wrote that night. He was always asking questions about everything: why the sky was blue, why birds could fly, why people fell in love. When he was Emmett's age, he told me that when he grew up, he wanted to be a dad because he thought being a dad was the most important job in the world. Writing about him helped keep his memory alive in a healthy way, not as a painful obsession, but as a celebration of who he had been. At 11 o'clock, I closed the notebook and went to sleep in my new bed, between sheets that smelled of floral fabric softener instead of tears. On my nightstand was a new photograph, the three of us at the county park last month, smiling under a blossoming dogwood tree. We were a different family than we had been, but we were a whole family. Before I fell asleep, as I did every night, I spoke to Brian in silence. Your children are okay, my love. They are strong, they are kind, and they are so much like you. I promise they will grow up knowing who you really were, and they will be proud to be your children. And for the first time in a long time, I fell asleep feeling that he had heard me. Because when you fight for the truth with all your heart, when you protect the people you love no matter the cost, when you refuse to surrender to injustice, in the end, love always wins. In the end, justice always arrives. And in the end, there is always a chance to start again. If you've made it this far with me, I ask you, have you ever been in a situation where the truth seemed impossible to prove? Or do you know someone who has? Tell me about it in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach someone else who might need to hear that it's possible to move forward, that it's possible to find justice, and that it's never too late to start a new life.